Last week, the First Presidency of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints issued a statement celebrating the 250th anniversary of the United States' founding, or what the cool kids are calling the semi-quincentennial. I invite you to read the entire statement. Here I'm putting it on screen so you can pause if you'd like. And I'll have more to say on the intersections of Mormonism and patriotism as this major commemorative years moves along this year. In fact, I have a major lecture that I'm giving on this topic in September. More details later. But here I want to focus on one particular portion of the statement, or a theme, a principle that we can take from how Latter-day Saint leaders are commemorating the American founding. Note that they are encouraging members to discuss the importance of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and how these documents support religious freedom and our God-given agency. They also call for a global fast on Sunday, July 5th to, quote, express gratitude for religious liberty and to pray that it be strengthened throughout the world. On the one hand, this focus makes a lot of sense. The LDS Church has done a lot to emphasize religious liberty in recent decades, even if it's a bit awkward to tie it to the United States when the LDS Church is much more of a global institution today. But as someone who's spent, let's call it, a fair bit of time researching Mormon patriotic sentiments, I think it's important to note what's not in this statement. They don't claim that the founding fathers were inspired of God. They don't equate the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution as quasi-scripture. They mostly frame America's founding role as a prelude to the Restoration, especially the establishment of religious liberty. Now, this religious liberty has been a hallmark of Dallin H. Oakes's apostolic and now presidential career, an obsession that you can find in many of his addresses that he believes is one of the most important principles in the modern world. But it has a context, and it's actually the culmination of a long evolution of how Latter-day Saints have viewed the founding, including principles of religious liberty. So in this video, I want to contextualize this First Presidency statement and put it within this much longer history. I'll touch on the long background of Mormon views of the founding, including the sacralization of the Declaration of Independence and Constitution in LDS thought in the mid-20th century. A move, as you'll see, I talk about from the patriotic dissenters of the 19th century to the Christian nationalists of the 20th. But then I'll highlight the recent shift in this degree to a more measured focus on religious liberty, what I'll call qualified patriotism. And then finally, I'll touch on how this actually might be a place of possible discordance with the broader religious right in America at this time during the rise of MAGA. That's a lot to cover, but we're going to try to do so efficiently. Let's jump into it. So much of Mormon patriotic rhetoric can, of course, be tied back to Joseph Smith himself, who dictated at least two revelations that directly touch on the Constitution and its founding and its lessons. Both of these revelations were received in the midst of the church's complications, we'll call them complications, with Missouri in 1832 and 1833. So in August of 1833, Joseph Smith dictates what comes to be known as D&C 98, which says this: I say unto you concerning the laws of land, it is my will that my people should observe to do all things whatsoever I command them, and that the law of the land, which is the Constitution, supporting that principles of freedom and maintaining rights and privileges, belongs to all mankind and justifiable before me. Therefore I, the Lord, justify you and your brethren of my church in befriending that law, which is the constitutional law of the land. So there you see a clear reference to the Constitution as the law of the land, encouraging Latter-day Saints to befriend the constitutional legal precedent, in other words, working within the constitutional order. And then, shortly afterwards, Joseph Smith dictates a revelation now canonizes D&C 101 that includes, among other things, for this purpose have I established the constitution of this land, by the hands of wise men whom I've raised up unto this very purpose, and redeemed the land by the shedding of blood. In other words, the Constitution was a divinely inspired document created by those that God had called up, and the Constitution was meant to preserve them in the context of the Mormon-Missouri conflict, that the Latter-day Saints would be redeemed and be returned back to their land. Spoiler alert, that didn't happen. Now, those verses from Joseph Smith's revelations had a number of broad interpretations over the years. There's a rich tradition of divergent political theologies that read these texts in very different ways. Is when Joseph Smith is referring to, through this revelatory language, the divine nature of the Constitution, is he referring to the Constitution as a whole and the revolutionary founders as a group? Or is he specifically referring to specific principles like religious liberty? You're going to see varying debates. Now, Joseph Smith himself moves away from this interpretation later on, as Latter-day Saints establish themselves in Nauvoo after being kicked out of Missouri. They become what I call patriotic critics, in that they are hearkening to what they call the founding principles of America, but denouncing the American federal order, who they believe are not living up to those principles. And they go even beyond that when Joseph Smith creates the Council of 50 in his final few months, a topic that I've covered in a previous video. They provide a brand new constitution because they argue the United States Constitution was fundamentally flawed because it did not recognize divine law. And then Joseph Smith is killed. Latter-day Saints are forced to leave the United States. Parley Pratt authors an editorial declaring independence from the United States, in an editorial titled Independence Declared Once Again, a fascinating document that I might do a full video on at some point. And for the rest of the 19th century, Latter-day Saints are fierce critics of the U.S. constitutional order, saying that the United States was not staying true to its values and were betraying the constitutional principles of especially religious freedom, especially over the matter of whether the Latter-day Saints could practice polygamy. The Reynolds v. United States decision in 1877, the Supreme Court decision that ruled that Latter-day Saints had the right to believe what they want but not practice what they want, was at the crux of the matter. And Latter-day Saint leaders, rather than following that constitutional order, went on the underground, became fugitives of the law for much of the 1880s, until Wilford Woodruff publicly renounced the practice in 1890, starting the slow process toward American assimilation, which is going to have distinct impacts on how Latter-day Saints view the American nation, as well as the founding. By the way, if you enjoy this type of nerdy content, make sure you are subscribed to this channel. I do deep dives on topics every Monday. I connect the past to the present, like in this video every Wednesday. And on Fridays, I pull back the curtain on the historian's craft, talking about new books, interviewing authors, digging into the documents behind these arguments so that you can have historical tools yourself. I'm in the middle of a multi-week series on what I'm calling the battles over Mormon history in the late 20th century. Please make sure you are not missing those. I'm really proud of these videos that are coming out every Monday and Friday, and they're going to culminate in a live discussion here on this YouTube channel on April 1st, a Wednesday at 7 p.m. Mountain Time, where I will be answering your questions about these conflicts over Mormon history, of which these patriotic concepts, of course, play a part. And I also recommend subscribing to my free Kit newsletter, and you can follow me on one of my various social media platforms where I produce videos that supplement these longer videos on YouTube. Links to all of those are in the video description. All right, let's get back to the qualified patriotism of the Mormon tradition. As Latter-day Saints tried to assimilate into American culture throughout the 20th century, one of the ways that they could do this is to show their reverence for the American founding and prove their patriotic bona fides, proving they belong as Americans because we too worship the founding fathers, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. So all of the dissenting spirit of their patriotism in the 19th century falls away, and they become much more Christian nationalists in the 20th century. They even reframe the tale of the pioneers as not fleeing from America, but extending America. Here is a 1947 magazine cover that showed the Latter-day Saints pioneers as an example of the American frontier spirit, something that Brigham Young and others back in 1847 might have felt uncomfortable with. But in the mid-20th century, during the Cold War and the broader social tumults that I've discussed in previous videos, none other than Ezra Taft Benson comes in and presents a unqualified Mormon Christian nationalism. He, along with Cleon Skousen, teach Latter-day Saints how to read LDS history and scripture in patriotic ways, and more importantly, to read the founding documents and the founding period in ways that emphasize God's role in establishing them. I recommend going to check out my previous video in which I interview Matthew Harris about his recent article on Christian nationalism. I'll put a link to that video in this video description. Now, I could do a lot on the Christian nationalism of Benson and others in the mid-20th century, but let me highlight at least 4 points that are quite common in much of their rhetoric. One, the founding fathers were godly men. They were not just inspired by God, but they were seeking to fulfill God's will. Two, that the founding of America was inspired by God at every step, that God was involved, and that, in the words of some evangelical historians that Ezra Benson often use, you can see the hand of the Lord in every minute of the revolution, that it was all inspired. And connected to that, number three, that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution are perfect documents that have quasi-scriptural status, that they can be fit along with your scriptural text and God speaking to you, a metaphor that Benson frequently said. And fourth, that this history and these documents demonstrate that the United States is a chosen nation with an exceptional destiny that stands apart from the world. All four of these principles are quite congruent with the Christian nationalism of the era that you might be hearing from Billy Graham and eventually Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson and others in the late 20th century. But while it makes Latter-day Saints fit into the broader religious right and carve out space for the moral majority coalition, for Latter-day Saints to finally have a seat at that table, it's increasingly uncomfortable for an international church that should be decentering its American, the Americanness of its origins. And so you see some wrestling within church leadership in the 1960s and 1970s, recognizing that one, the unqualified celebration of Ezra Benson's does not really fit the reality of the history. And two, the church has to become much less parochial in celebrating just America rather than the world. Not all nations in which the Mormons are growing celebrate democracy, and they have to appear less American to be accepted on the global stage. And that's what's going to lead Latter-day Saints to enter a new era in how they view the American founding and the founding documents. Starting in the 1980s and 1990s, LDS leaders were seeking a framework that was more respectable in approach and much more global in tenor. And religious freedom was one of those principles that can be transferred to all these different contexts and can be separated from the political and partisan nature of American nationalist disputes. And further, it would be a way that they would no longer be sacralizing the American founders for an international global body that is not as interested in, say, sacralizing George Washington. And few individuals represent this shift more acutely than Dallin H, who becomes an LDS apostle in 1984 after serving on the Utah Supreme Court, as well as previously being a legal scholar and frequently speaking out on constitutional issues. In his time as the Quorum of the 12, would slowly move the church, building on some of those principles. It's not a great divorce from the Benson model, but he qualifies it and he kind of scales down the impact of what they view of the founding fathers and the founding documents. And perhaps the best document that lays this out is an essay that he published in the Ensign magazine in February 1992, titled The Divinely Inspired Constitution. By the title itself, you might think this sounds very much like Benson, and Benson probably would have liked it just based on the title. But notably, he scales back some of the Christian nationalist rhetoric and provides a new framework, what I'm calling qualified patriotism, for the Latter-day Saint tradition. Notably, he explicitly says that not every portion of the Constitution is divinely inspired. Here's some key excerpts from the text. It was a miracle that the Constitution could be drafted and ratified, but what is there in the text of the Constitution that is divinely inspired? Reverence for the United States Constitution is so great that sometimes we speak of as if its every word and phrase had the same standing as Scripture. That is, by the way, a very direct critique of Ezra Benson, who said those very things. Personally, I have never considered it necessary to defend every line of Constitution as Scripture. For example, I find nothing scriptural in the compromise on slavery, or the minimum age or years of citizenship for congressmen, senators, or president. Now, that may seem a subtle shift, but it's actually quite important, moving away from the Benson model. He's emphasizing that there are particular principles in the Constitution that are divinely inspired, not the entirety of the Constitution, and among them, religious liberty is going to take the foremost place among those divine principles, because in the ensuing years, religious liberty becomes all the more important to Oaks in particular, and the church in general. It becomes a rallying cry for Christian conservatives in response to what they denounce as the secularization of America and the undercutting of morals. Gay marriage, of course, being the cornerstone issue, and Oaks and others would often denounce the gay marriage crusade, the attempt to legalize same-sex marriage, as undercutting the America's foundational values. But after the Obergefell decision in 2015, Oaks now comes to emphasize the need to cherish the principles of religious liberty, which means, in his argument, carving out exceptions for faith-based institutions. The address that probably captures this the best is his 2021 speech to the University of Virginia as part of their Joseph Smith lecture series titled Going Forward with Religious Freedom and Non-Discrimination, in which he says the hallmark of America is maybe not those divine foundational values like traditional marriage, which he had been emphasizing before, but the idea of religious liberty, allowing these churches to dictate their own boundaries and that they should not be infringed upon. And finally, this emphasis on religious liberty and placing it as the core principle that comes from the founding not only helps in the culture wars, especially over LGBTQ issues, but it is also a principle that can be transferred across the globe. That same year, 2021, that Oaks spoke to University of Virginia, he also delivered a general conference address at the April General Conference titled Defending Our Divinely Inspired Constitution. In many ways, he was restating a lot of what he said in the 1992 Ensign issue. But now you see it in a much more global context, because he says that the principle of religious freedom, the core principle from the constitutional and the American founding, he argues, shares a common heritage of constitutions across the globe, meaning that the Constitution should be celebrated, not because it makes the United States an exceptionalist nation, which had been the tenor of those celebrations for a century, but instead, the Constitution should be celebrated for providing a pattern for all different countries in the globe to come to this divine principle. This is a much more qualified patriotism for a modern global context, and even within the United States context, reflecting how politics and partisan movements have shifted the entire playing field, which is another important element I want to talk about. Because I'm wondering, and I will confess that this is a bit speculative because it's a bit preliminary in this long historical trajectory, I'm wondering if this particular framework for understanding the founding and religious liberty in general is going to serve as a discordant, uncomfortable displacement between Latter-day Saints and the MAGA right, the Make America Great Again cultural movement behind the Donald Trump and the modern Republican Party. Because the Christian nationalism that's at the heart of the MAGA movement today, that seems so triumphant in American society, is in many ways much more like the Christian nationalism that Ezra Benson and others were presenting decades ago than it is like the Dallin H. Oaks qualified patriotism now. It's a calling to return to only accepting the right religions that fit. And in reality, this Christian nationalism is at its root a critique of religious liberty that allows everyone to practice the religions they want. For example, I am in Texas, and the current political campaigns for Senate and Congress have led to an escalation of anti-Islamic sentiment, this Islamophobia, that has been quite explicit in saying that Islam does not have a place within the United States. Notably, Oaks and the church leaders in recent years have done more to build their interdenominational and interreligious collaborations and workings with groups like Islam. And this framework that Oaks and others are trumpeting, which emphasize the importance of religious exceptions and groups operated within their own spheres, is in conflict with the anti-Islamic sentiment of the MAGA right. And further, Oaks has also spoken out against the populism of today's MAGA movement, insisting that the Constitution requires slow and deliberate change that are tethered to institutions. Very much a message out of step with the anti-institutional nature of MAGA populism. It's also out of step with, of course, the progressive populism that you see on the American left. So I'm wondering if this framing of religious liberty and this understanding of the constitutional order that we see in the First Presidency statement and how they are viewing the founding and its legacies is going to be in conflict with American society going forward, both the MAGA religious right and the progressive American left. And more pressingly, I'm wondering if LDS membership are therefore going to be willing to follow Oaks into this model of qualified patriotism. There has certainly been a magnification of many Latter-day Saints in the America who are embracing the extreme right-wing policies. And the church, as a result, has seemed less willing to enter into these debates like they had before. They seem a bit gun-shy after the COVID battles where they asked members to vaccinate and wear masks, and it's quite clear, received quite a bit of a backlash. So we see a discordance not just between Oaks's qualified patriotism and MAGA Christian nationalism, but potential disagreement between Oaks's qualified patriotism and mainstream Mormonism's Christian nationalism. That's going to be interesting to watch over the coming years. Now, I hope you enjoyed this video. If so, please hit the like button and share with others so we can broaden the conversation. Make sure you are subscribed to this channel. And if you want to give back, and I'm so grateful for the many of you who have given back, you can become a member, where for a very nominal fee, you get early access to the videos, you get little icons next to your name when you comment, and most importantly, you know you are supporting this type of work that goes into these videos, trying to improve our public conversation. This video, I hope, represents the importance of understanding the historical context for things that might appear very baked in stone. In other words, the LDS First Presidency statement on religious liberty at the core of the founding is not how the LDS Church has always thought about those documents and that principle. So as the Latter-day Saint Church and its members commemorate America's 250th anniversary, they are fitting within a larger story as well as a broader context. The evolution in the Latter-day Saints from patriotic dissenters to Christian nationalists, and whether they'll follow Oaks into qualified patriotism, as well as how do they relate with America's broader polarized culture, especially the MAGA right and Christian nationalism. I think there's lots of questions that are still to be answered, which I'm going to be honest, I don't know how they will be answered, but I do know that they will fit within a history, and they need to be understood within this longer line of contingency and cultural tradition. Again, another reminder that history has never been more relevant than the present, even if the future seems somewhat in doubt.